Hey everybody, welcome. This is my YouTube series on preparing Canadian personal T1 tax returns. My name is Ian DeNovo and I'm a professional accountant in Toronto and the founder and instructor at CanadianTaxAcademy.com, where I offer some practical real-world training courses in the areas of personal income tax, corporate income tax, and a number of other tax areas. If you're interested in taking some personal tax courses, you can scroll over to the bottom in the description section here at YouTube, and I do offer some promotions, or check out the pop-up bubbles that come on every now and then, and you can take courses at CanadianTaxAcademy.com for a very reasonable price that you'll find is very competitive compared to other options out there in the world of Canadian tax. So, without further ado, let's get on to the training series here. These series of 4 tutorials will teach you how to prepare a basic Canadian T1 tax return. So let's get going. All right, everyone, welcome to part 3 here of my series on YouTube on preparing the T1 general return for Canadian taxpayers. This tutorial is all about tax credits. So if you remember from the previous tutorial, we looked at deductions, things such as RRSP deductions, childcare expenses, pension plan deductions, union dues, and so forth. Those were deductions from total income on the T1 itself. Now, you've probably heard of a lot of tax credits, so I get a credit for that. What is a tax credit? Well, the tax credits are different from deductions in that they're offered as a deduction from the federal and provincial taxes. A lot of the provinces have very similar deductions and credits, so you will see that here in a minute. So tax credits themselves are not reported on the T1 itself. They're not reported on that jacket, those first 4 or 5 pages. Those are actually on Schedule 1. So here I have Schedule 1, but if you have tax software, all you need to do is just go to the Returns and Schedules, click on Schedule 1, and this is the federal tax schedule. So this is how the government and the tax software determines the tax liability for whoever's return you're doing here. So as you can see, the tax credits are in the upper portion, the first portion here of the tax return itself. And we'll go over some of these in a little bit of detail here. And obviously in the tax course at Canadian Tax Academy, we go through each and every one of these in detail so that you know the rules inside and out. Now on Schedule 1 here as well, it also goes through the tax calculation for the federal tax. So you'll see here that these show the brackets of the federal tax rates. These are then combined with the provincial tax rates of the person who you're preparing, or yourself, depending on what province you reside in. But let's go back and let's look at John's personal tax credits here. So as I mentioned, the tax software does a great job of populating the credits that someone is entitled to from the slips itself. So as you can see here, for example, on line 308 and on 312, the tax software has already populated this with the CPP premiums and the EI premiums that John paid on his T4. So if you remember from his T4 slip, John paid CPP and EI obviously from his work. He had that withdrawn from his paycheck to get his net pay. So those are reported here on 308 and 312 because there is a personal tax credit for those amounts. Also on line 363, this was populated automatically. This is the Canada employment amount. So this relates to people who actually have employment income. If you have a T4, technically the first $1,146 is tax-free, or it just gets added to the basic personal amount here. So you'll see here at the top that every Canadian citizen is entitled to the basic personal amount for the year. For the year that we're doing here, it happened to be $11,327. So again, though, it's important because depending on if somebody entered Canada, left Canada, whatever their status is, non-residents and things like that, they might not be entitled to the full amount. So again, if you go back to the first tutorial here on the playlist, I'll go through some of the details to make sure that you enter the proper information on the personal section of the T1 return. All right, so all of these credits don't necessarily apply to everyone. So obviously things like the age credit, the age amount here, that only pertains to people who are over 65 years of age. Then there's things like volunteer firefighters amount. Remember, this slip applies to every single Canadian. So don't think that just because there's all these boxes here that you're entitled to claim all these types of credits, right? This only applies to whatever you might be entitled to. So let's assume here, for example, that John had some medical expenses and some donations. So as you can see here, if we scroll down, there's a section here on medical expenses. I won't get into the rules and regulations on medical expenses because, again, those can be quite complex. But let's just assume that John here had some dental work done for about $3,000 during the year. So I'm just going to type in the information here. Dr. Palmer, I guess, doesn't really matter. This is just a worksheet. The name of patient, I'm sorry, that's John. Dr. Palmer, dental. Let's just assume that he had $4,000 of work done on his teeth, and he paid the dentist. So if we go back to Schedule 1 here, you'll see that the tax software populates the $4,000 from the worksheet and calculates the credit. You know, there is a deductible based on 3% of income, but again, that's beyond the scope of this tutorial. So there you go. He's entered his medical expenses. We'll also get him to enter his donations. So if we go to tax and credits, there's a donations worksheet here. And let's just say that he sponsors a child through the United Way or whatever the case might be. It's $418 that he has a tax receipt for. So he enters that into the worksheet here. Again, the software will automatically fill out the appropriate schedule, which in this case is the Schedule 9, and it'll claim the tax credit properly for him. And if we go back to Schedule 1 here, you'll see that there's a donations and gift tax credit of that $136.72, which is the federal portion. There's also an Ontario portion. Now, if you just go through this, you can see that there are many credits. These are sometimes what we refer to in the tax world as boutique tax credits. So sometimes a government, when they come into office, they'll make promises to certain areas of, of society, whatever the case is, and they'll create a tax credit. Perfect example here is the public transit amount. This is relatively new within the last probably 10 years or so, I guess, where the government allows people who have monthly passes to be able to claim a tax credit to try to get people to start taking more public transit. Whether or not that's worked, I don't know, you can be the judge of that. But needless to say, there is a tax credit for it. So if you have tax credits, you basically come to Schedule 1 of the T1 return. So open that up on your software. And for the most part, many of these will just have a drill down menu or some help in terms of trying to calculate it out. So for example, if the public transit amount, if we had that, well, if we double click that, there's a section here where you can help it calculate what the public transit amount is. And, something as simple as a public transit pass, you'd be surprised at how the little intricacies can make a difference in terms of who claims it and whatnot. So again, very simple in terms of reporting the credits, but determining sometimes whether you're eligible for the credits or not, well, that's an entirely different story. So that pretty much covers it here. Once the tax credits are all entered into the software here, Schedule 1 calculates John's federal tax. So as you can see here, on his income, he's going to have to pay $5,781.01 of federal tax. And you can see the brackets here. And that's not the end of the story because these are only federal credits. So in this case, John lives in Ontario. So if we go to the tax and credits and we open up the Ontario tax form, you'll see that it's very, very similar to the Schedule 1. So this is the equivalent of the Ontario Schedule 1. They have a basic amount, which is what I had explained earlier. It's a lot less in Ontario, but you'll see the same credits for the most part here. You'll see the CPP credit, you'll see the EI credit, things like the disability amount, the caregiver amount credit, the pension income credit. Those are all pretty standard across all of the provinces. However, what you don't see here, for example, in Ontario, is the public transit amount because the Ontario government didn't follow suit with the federal government on the public transit. Not every province will have the equivalent of the federal tax credit, so you have to be careful there. So when you're doing a tax return, you might want to look at Schedule 1 in conjunction with the tax calculation form for whatever province you are resident in, and just make sure that you claim all the credits properly. As you can see here, the medical expenses is definitely something that carries over onto the provinces, and the donations as well. It's just different calculations sometimes depending on the province of residence. Same applies to the tax payable. So as you can see, these are the tax brackets in Ontario. So the tax software will appropriately calculate the taxes on $54,019 here. And this amount, if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that the Ontario tax is just under $3,000 in John's case here. So between the two taxes, federal and Ontario, when you've entered all the credits, all the deductions, you should be almost pretty good to go in terms of filing your returns, as long as you've entered all the information in properly. So in the next tutorial coming up here, we're going to look at the actual Ontario tax and the federal tax and all the other taxes. We're going to look at that section of the T1 return, and then we're going to look at reasonability and things like that to make sure that there are no glaring errors on your part. So that's coming up next.